Okay, this is my first YouTube video, so apologies for any screw-ups that I make. I've not done this before. It's quite, and I'm aware that this video is already quite old, so apologies for that as well, but I thought it deserves an answer if nobody else is going to do it. So I divided up your video into several little chapters, actually into 3 chapters. The one where you complain about the banking system, the one where you complain about Reagan and so on and so forth, and the one where you say that capitalism, the free market, doesn't work apparently. And I'll start with banking because it's the easiest and the least long-winded. Actually, surprise, surprise. And I'd like to introduce you and everybody else to a concept called the Austrian theory of the business cycle. What this says is essentially that government central banking with reduced interest rates, that we've seen between 2004 and 2006 from the Federal Reserve. Anyway, reduced interest rates. Sorry, I'm moving around. This is probably really distracting. Reduced interest rates lowers the risk of investment from companies. That's why they exist. The government lowers the interest rates to increase growth, supposedly, because more investments are made and more people take out loans and credit and so on and so forth. And what this means is that because of the reduced risk, there are many malinvestments, if you'd like to put it that way, which means that essentially you make unprofitable loans, people take out loans they can't afford to pay back and default on them, and eventually it all comes to a head and there's a recession. That's a subprime mortgage crisis, if you will. And I'd just like to point out that it was the US government that guaranteed 70% of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac's mortgages. So essentially what it meant, that was somebody who couldn't afford to pay back their mortgage on a house could default and the government would back it. And that's all very well if you want to provide cheap housing to people without actually building houses with government sponsorship. But what it means is that when there's a lot of defaulting and a lot of banks going bust, you have a major problem. And the reason the banks are going bust is because they loan each other large amounts of money. They borrow money from the government at this reduced interest rate. Let me show you an example. If the interest rate is 4% and I invest, if I loan from the government to invest, I'm more likely to take out a larger loan a smaller loan than if the interest rate was 2%. And throughout 2004 and 2006, the Federal Reserve slashed the interest rates, and they're slashing them now, which is just going to create the problem all over again. And I understand that was quite long-winded and quite repetitive, and I'm really not good at this, but what essentially I'm saying is that the Federal Reserve, the system of central banking, creates recessions, subprime. Oh, I've been looking at the 4 all this time. Anyway, creates subprime crises like these by inducing malinvestments that come out. So you recognize that some people like the honourable gentleman from Texas, Mr. Ron Paul, people like Ron Paul understand these things, and you seem to think that the answer, well, their answer, our answer, is to put money control back in the hands of the government. That's not it at all. Whether the money supply is controlled by the Federal Reserve or Congress or whatever legislature or executive you choose, that's totally avoiding the point. The point is that the government, still has a monopoly on the production of money. They still have a legal tender monopoly. Whether it's accountable or not is not the point. The point is the government is still messing things up by intervening in the money supply, and the idea of money itself is not a government invented thing. Money is just a way for individuals to make bargaining between each other easier, bartering. That's where money came from in the first place. So yes, I see you understand that people don't always blame big banking, they blame the government, but your response to that was to invent a scenario that we don't actually support and then knock it down with your own argument. I believe that's a straw man, actually. It's quite a fallacy. Yeah, anyway, next. The next chapter, I think, was... What was it? Yeah, it was your contention that people like Bush, McCain, even Reagan are called free marketeers. Frankly, they're not. They're raging statists. Look at how the U.S. government budget has increased under Bush, and how in fact it increased under Reagan. And they called Reagan the great capitalist because he did reduce taxes, he did reduce regulation, but nonetheless he still increased government spending, and that's the crux, because for every dollar spent by the government, that's $1 that's not spent by the private market. And although Reagan may seem like a great capitalist, he increased the deficit by $200 billion, $300 billion, and he did this via debt, basically. Minimal taxation, and he did it for the purposes of, yes, defeating communism, it's a noble ideal, but he did it for the purposes of expanding aggressively, which is not the free market ideal. The old free marketeers, Mises, Hayek, didn't support aggression, they didn't support preemptive war like Mr. Bush does. And they call themselves free marketeers, but really the evidence shows that they're nothing but statists who give money to their friends. And really, there are no real free marketeers in the West apart from Ron Paul himself, who has no real chance at winning the election, unfortunately. Which moves me on to my last point, which was your contention that free markets don't work. And the evidence you use to prove that free markets don't work is actually an example of free markets not being allowed to work. But the freest economies in the world today is Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia, and New Zealand, and they are some of the most prosperous countries in the world. They're some of the best places to live. And look at Hong Kong, for example. People streamed across the border from communist China to Hong Kong. It has a population of 4 million people, and it's basically a small island. Now, it's been populated for maybe 200 years, and where do you think those 4 million people came from? They didn't. I mean, you can say the Chinese breed like rabbits. That's not necessarily true, but yeah, there is a huge degree of immigration there. What did Kennedy say? Freedom has its problems, but we never had to build a wall to keep our people in. Yeah, mixed markets is what you advocate, and that's very weird for a libertarian to do so. You like to say how balance is the greatest thing. Well, that's probably a misrepresentation of your position, but you like to claim balance is what we should be aiming for when you call yourself a libertarian. That's not libertarianism, that's social democracy. You're not a libertarian, you're a social democrat. Anyway, the free market doesn't contend, like you suggest, that all people are good. It doesn't contend that all people are rational. It just contends that all people act in their own self-interests. And ultimately, the spontaneous order of market anarchy organized by nothing apart from the actions of supply and demand in the market has created the greatest and most prosperous time in human history. There's no other time in human history where humans have lived as well as we have. And you may cite the 19th century as an argument against the free market, but actually, if you take 1799 and then you take 1899, and you see the difference in wealth for the average working class person in those times, it's the growth in terms of wealth is absolutely astounding. It's unrivaled anywhere in human history. Not even from the dawn of the 20th century to the dawn of the 21st century did you have as much growth in the standard of living for an average person as you did throughout the 19th century. And that's really the crux of the argument, is that capitalism, while it may not be equal, provides the greatest proportional to time growth of the standard of living for humans. I'd like to finish on one quote, which is, I've actually forgotten it, but I suggest that you read this book. It's called The Road to Serfdom by Frederick August von Hayek. It cost me £10 from Amazon.co.uk.